So what we're going to do in this video is introduce the investing investigation for Stage 1 General Maths. First thing I want to really highlight is the fact that what you are aiming to do is to satisfy all of these performance standards, and all of them are going to be assessed against in your investigation at some point or another. We'll talk about these later in the video, but I cannot stress enough how important these are to get your head around. A quick rundown of the investigation. Basically what this investigation is doing is putting you in the shoes of a 21-year-old who wants to buy a house. We're not going to be talking about the actual home loan or any borrowing calculations. We don't do any of that until year 12. What we are doing is focusing on saving and investing money in order to save up the deposit. This is the aim of the investigation. You're trying to save up a deposit for the house in the quickest way possible. What you need to do in relation to that is think about how much money you can put aside after your expenses, and you're going to look into how much it actually costs in order to get to the stage where you can borrow this money. First thing that you're going to need to do, on the task sheet, each student has got their salary and their partner's salary listed on that. If your partner does not have a salary, or it just has no partner there, you can either consider them unemployed or you can just choose to be single. It's completely up to you. What you'll need to do is, first of all, you're going to use the current tax rates in order to calculate your income after the tax has been taken out. So there is a link that you'll be able to access, and that is just below, or you can actually just type that in to the to your internet browser. So you're going to get your income, and then you need to figure out how much of that you actually take home after tax. When we're talking about how much money you can put aside, this is where we need to get into budget planning. Again, there's a really good link that I recommend that everyone uses because it's really comprehensive, and it gives you a pretty good idea of basically anything that you would spend money on as a young adult. You need to think about what story you've developed for your character. So don't spend too much time thinking about their job and how it relates to the income, but make it reasonable. You do need to think about considering as many expenses as you can, but what the recommendation is don't get too caught up in being too particular with the values. You can round it up to like the closest 50 or the closest $5, just to make things a little bit more straightforward for you. You're going to need to also find a house that you want to live in. Again, please don't spend too much time on this one. The main thing that I want to really highlight is choosing a house that is in a reasonable price range for your salary. If you have a large salary and you don't have many expenses, you don't want to choose a cheap house because this is going to make you save the deposit really quickly. And when you make changes to the values a little bit later, such as like the compounding periods and the interest rate on your bank account, there's not going to be much difference between these times that it's going to take to save for it. So it's really not worth doing this if you want to get a decent grade. Similarly, don't choose a ridiculously expensive house if it's just like a single lower income, because you'll be saving for a really long time, and there's a lot of limitations when that comes into play. For example, if you're saving for a house and you've got a large salary and not many expenses, and it only takes you 2 years to save for your house, well, that's already pretty good. If you're trying to make that even quicker, there's not much difference between, say, saving for 2 years and saving for 1.5 years. So it doesn't really show the difference in savings there. Similarly, if you choose a really expensive house, you might be saving up for 20 years. By that stage, think about how old you are. You're probably about 40. By that stage, you well and truly should have been able to save up for a house in this investigation. When we talk about the actual deposit and how much you need to save up for, there's a couple of different things associated with that. You need to figure out what percentage of the house price that you're going to pay to the bank as a deposit. Certain banks have a minimum deposit of a certain percentage. Some of them will give you quite low percentage deposits. So you need to consider the benefits and disadvantages of whether you go with a higher or lower deposit. The amount that most banks will ask for, basically as proof that you can service this loan, usually between 5% and 20%. If it's any higher than that, it's probably going to make things a little bit harder for you. If it's any lower, there might be banks that offer this, but you do need to talk about the pros and cons. So the deposit is going to be a percentage of your house price. You also need to consider stamp duty, which is a government tax that is paid in South Australia when you purchase a house. And there's also some other upfront costs that you might need to add on, such as conveyancing fees, so paying a lawyer to basically sign the papers for you to purchase this house. Again, we've got links in here which will help you out with finding those percentages and those costs. When it comes to saving up, what you should be doing is, this is where it's, again, an investigation. So you need to research these different savings accounts. Make sure you're finding these from Australian banks. There is pretty much a recommendation that you find 3 different accounts. So this allows you to compare the different interest rates. Generally, if you can't find their compounding periods, you can put them as 12. And generally your payments, you can choose how often you're making your payments in there. But most banks will will compound your interest monthly. You're going to use your graphics calculator and the compound interest function a lot in this investigation. So when we get into class, we'll go through what everything means in there again. Considering inflation is really important, because when you're saving up your money, as we've talked about in class, your money gets worth less over time. So let's say you're saving up for 5 years. By the time that 5 years comes around, inflation has affected the value of your money. It's potentially put the house price up. So we are going to use, again, the inflated value equation, which is listed just here, where our PV is going to be the original deposit amount that we've calculated with all of the upfront costs. I is going to be the interest rate, which the interest rate is actually the inflation rate. And I'm just going to change that now so that we don't forget. So the inflation rate you're going to need to research as well. What you'll find is that there's going to be a lot of different values. Just choose one that is recent, and then you can use that as your inflation rate for this equation. There's a few assumptions and limitations that are going to come up throughout this, so please just keep that in mind as we work through it. When you have completed calculating this new inflated value of your deposit and upfront costs, you're going to need to calculate the new amount of time that it takes to save up for that new deposit. Some of you might realize that this kind of can be a bit of a circular process. So when you calculate the new time that it takes to save up for the new deposit, it's not going to be the same amount of years. This is just a limitation to the investigation that you can write down. When we get into task B, this is where we're starting to look at the bank accounts that we had earlier. We're going to choose one of them, and we're going to start making some changes to the variables in the graphics calculator. We want to link these to real life events, or we want to have a good explanation for them. So for example, you can change the payment or the compounding frequency. So let's say you go from paying your savings account monthly, you could change that to fortnightly, you could change it to weekly. Daily is probably not a reasonable thing to do, but if you want to investigate that, you can go ahead. Compounding frequency, you can play around with a little bit. You will need to come up with a reason why the bank is changing that though. You can also find a new bank, so you could find a better interest rate or a higher interest rate. Sometimes this is good to investigate on a bit of a timeline. So you might have put your money in a bank for 2 years, and then you find that there's a better bank that's come up, or interest rates have changed. The more of a storyline you can come up with that one, the better, because if you just change the interest rate, well, you've basically already done that in the earlier part. You could also receive a lump sum of money. So you might receive a gift from a family member, or you might receive a bonus from your job, which you can deposit in during the period of time that you're saving. Again, that's going to come up with a couple of different calculations. So think about it as a timeline. You can also increase your PMT. So you might have made some space in your budget. You might have got rid of some of your spending habits. This is going to increase the amount of money you can put into your bank account. Again, this is something that you'll do a couple of years down the track maybe. So again, thinking about the timeline. You're also going to need to make predictions. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but predictions are super important because that is one of the performance standards that you are marked against. So making predictions that are reasonable with some kind of reasoning behind it. Then you do the maths, then you talk about whether your prediction was correct or not, or whether your prediction was supported or not is better. In addition to task B, task C is where we start to look at more creative options to save quicker. So task B, we were sort of playing around with the values on the calculator. Now this is where you're sort of starting to extend your understanding. So you're going to look at sort of different ways that you might save up your money. You can think about things like stocks, crypto, if you want to get into that, alternative investments. Basically, you're trying to consider ways that you can actually save up in a quicker way, but that are different to just changing values on your calculator. Again, make lots of predictions. When we talk about making predictions, the specific part of the performance standards is in the A grade band. We're talking about making a formation and testing of appropriate predictions using sound mathematical evidence. In all parts of your investigation, basically this means you're going to explain the aim for each section, then you're going to make a prediction, then you're going to do the maths to test this prediction, and then you're going to summarize what you found. So you're going to say, was the prediction supported or was it not supported? If it wasn't supported, that is absolutely fine. You might have made a pretty sound prediction, but it might just have come out completely different, and that's okay. It is also really important to acknowledge the assumptions and limitations. So whenever you are doing a calculation, we're assuming a lot of things to make it easier for ourselves or to make it possible to calculate. Whenever we do make an assumption, this limits the basically it limits the accuracy, or it limits the realisticness of the investigation. So we need to talk about that. The things that you need in your completed investigation are an introduction, which is outlining the problem and its significance to you as a person in Australia, the features of the investigation, and the context that we're looking into. You need to talk about the method throughout required, where we're trying to find a solution. We're using mathematical models like compound interest, and you're going to talk about the strategies that we use. The real main part of it is where we're showing the application of this model or the strategy. So we're basically talking about how we're using the compound interest function on our calculator, how we're generating and collecting all the relevant data, and we're giving details of how we found it. So this means whenever you get information from online, you need to reference it in some way. You can do it in whichever way you feel suitable with. For example, you're collecting the tax rates, you're collecting the inflation rate, and you're also collecting data on what sort of bank accounts are out there. Obviously, mathematical calculations and results are super important. A lot of people tend to use tables for this so that they've got all of their stuff in a nice, clear place. And we're going to show you an exemplar, which will explain a little bit about the sort of setup of it. Whenever you make these calculations, you need to analyze and interpret the results. So you're basically comparing and contrasting each of your different components in there. You're also going to need to, again, reference the limitations and the assumptions. So you can do that throughout, and then it's good to summarize that at the end. You're going to state all of these results, as we said earlier, and then you're going to include appendices and a bibliography as appropriate. So bibliography, or whatever your sort of reference list, whichever one you've used. Keep in mind, there is a page limit of 8 pages in this investigation. Appendices and the bibliography do not count towards this. So 8 pages, there will be a minimum text size of probably about 10. So please make sure you stick to that. But the appendices is where any of your extra information can go that doesn't need to be basically seen in text. When it comes to your analysis and discussion, your section should always include and discuss things like the choice of why you chose that percentage of the deposit. You should probably show, a lot of the higher grade ones show a table which again summarizes the different strategies and what you found from it. So when you change the PMT, what was the change in the N value, things like that. And again, assumptions and limitations. Assumptions are things that you have assumed or stated in order to make your calculations possible or to make them more straightforward. We do a lot of assuming without even really noticing it. Whenever we leave our interest rate as constant, we're making an assumption that it hasn't changed throughout. And we've talked a little bit about this during the term. Limitations are limits that calculations have they've limited either the accuracy of our investigation or they've kind of limited the realisticness. Remember that each assumption has a limitation. So you can always come up with some kind of limitation whenever you've made an assumption. An example from a different context, we've assumed that the temperature remained constant throughout the period of experiment. Due to the extended period of time and the cold temperature outside, this is unlikely. Therefore, that is a limitation of the calculations. In your conclusion, you do not have to make it very long. Just use this to summarize the findings from your entire investigation, and you can make any closing remarks or suggestions. Generally, when you're making suggestions, you can make suggestions into things that you could also have investigated. It's better not to use this as a place to say, it would have been better if I spent more time on this or something like that. That's not really a relevant thing. We're just sort of suggesting things that would have made your investigation better, but may not have been possible due to understanding constraints or things like that. So an example, very brief. Overall, it was found that the heat transfer through copper pipes occurred with the greatest rate per unit of time. This was also the most expensive material, however, so it may only be used sparingly in some cases. Even with this high price, the benefits are clear, and thus most applications will find that copper is the most appropriate material. So that doesn't have to be super long, but you do want to make sure that you've got like a bookend to your investigation. Okay, performance standards. When we're talking about the performance standards, this is one half of them, where we're talking about concepts and techniques. So when we are going through and marking your investigations, we are rating this on a scale from A through to E. If you can show that you have comprehensive knowledge and understanding of concepts and relationships, that is a big tick. So basically that is being able to show your understanding through the concepts and relationships of maths. You're going to select and apply your mathematical techniques highly effectively. So using techniques and algorithms to find efficient and accurate solutions to routine and complex problems in a variety of contexts. So this is basically choosing the right method to calculate things and choosing the right processes. when it says routine and complex, the complex falls away as you get down to the C grade. So if you can show that you've got a more comprehensive understanding, you're going to be using more complex problems and finding the right way to go about them. Developing and applying your mathematical models to find concise and accurate solutions. So that is basically going to be using the graphics calculator and using your formulas and equations to find accurate and concise solutions. So that means using the right amount of decimal places, using the correct rounding up, things like that. And again, the final one is using electronic technology appropriately and effectively in routine and complex problems. If you're doing it in just routine ones, that's pretty much just putting your values in to the compound interest thing and getting one answer. If you're doing more complex ones, that's using answers from previous calculations. So for example, if you change the interest rate partway through and you follow through, that would be a complex problem. The reasoning and communication is basically looking at your written part in general. So if you can interpret your results in the context of the problem, that is really highly regarded. So that means that you are interpreting pretty much everything you've written with some kind of relation back to the context. You're drawing conclusions that are logical from your results with a good understanding of their reasonableness and limitations. This is your assumptions and limitations. If you're showing the fact that you understand what assumptions are being made and how they might limit your investigation, you should be quite high up on this grade band. Using appropriate mathematical notation, representations and terminology. So that's using the correct variables, using the correct terms, explaining things with the right sort of lingo, and I guess whenever you're putting your inputs for the calculator, you need to show that you've used the correct ones in your investigation. Communication of mathematical ideas and reasoning to develop logical and concise arguments. This is where you are analysing things. So you are talking about the differences between certain changes that you've made, and you're making arguments as to why they are better or worse. And then finally, probably not the most important one, but one of the ones that sometimes gets a bit missed is formation and testing of appropriate predictions using sound mathematical evidence. As I mentioned earlier, please make sure you're putting predictions every single time you change something. You want to have a brief explanation of why you think the prediction is correct, and you need to summarize it as well.